of the Congress, which is entitled Determining the Impacts, the Importance of Measuring the Scope and Impact of Infringement. And the moderator, when this polite session will finish, will be Mr. Jeff Hardy, who is the coordinator of the ICC BASCAP, the International Chamber of Commerce Business Action to Stop Counterfeiting and Piracy. As I mentioned, we have just 1 hour and 15 minutes and I think 6 speakers. And in order to allow some time for questions, we have to start in time. Just before starting, I would like to remind you to switch off your phone and also to inform you that this amphitheater has only interpretation in English and in French. So Jeff, I give you the floor as soon as you start.
I don't have one for the next speaker. We'll just use that key. That's fine.
Okay.
I'll leave.
Okay.
You gonna tell that joke again? I don't have a presentation.
We don't have any presentation.
But later,
so
there will be later, so.
Okay. So I just run this one.
Okay, terrific. Hello? All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Hardy. I'm the coordinator of Business Action to Stop Counterfeiting and Piracy. That's an initiative of the International Chamber of Commerce. And I welcome you to the first session, the first discussion level session today. And I think we're going to get to be the trial session on clearing the room after press conferences and getting slideshows to work out. I think we have a terrific panel, perhaps maybe the most interesting panel that you're going to see at this Congress. But I have a couple of announcements to make. 2 of our esteemed 5 speakers were unable to make it. Damien O'Flaherty from Frontier Economics is unable to make it, and Dr. Omer from the University in Saudi Arabia was also unable to make it. So they send their regrets. I think they're meeting with the French minister or something. What I'd like to do to get started is to ask, I guess maybe somewhat rhetorically to the audience, whether anyone else noticed that all of the speakers, and I mean all of the speakers in the opening plenary session, did you notice that they all mentioned brake pads? Did you notice that every one of them was communicating that brake pads were a problem? Well, I did. And I think the reason that all of our speakers are using brake pads is because they're looking for a metaphor, a way to communicate the problem that we're dealing with. And in many cases, brake pads embody the product theft that companies are experiencing. Brake pads embody the health and safety issues that we find related to pharmaceuticals, for example. The organized crime that's involved in shipping the brake pads through free trade zones are an embodiment of a metaphor for the linkage to the criminal activity. I think what we're dealing with is a situation where we collectively know that there's a problem out there, but we're grappling with how we communicate the size and scope of that problem. And it leads us to use anecdotal stories. We have some statistics of deaths related to fake drugs. We've got the brake pad story. But each and every one of our speakers are saying that it's important that we, quote, grasp hard to grasp its enormity. Quote, the harmful impact on our economies. Quote, the huge threat being presented. And quote, there is not an understanding of the value of the intangibles and what's at risk. That was a quote by Mr. Gurry. So to introduce this panel, I want to just set this up. And the importance of the work that these people have done is to try to tell that story that we've been telling with anecdotes and with references to the products such as brake pads, to tell that story with math and with numbers, to look into what it means when we say there's a death associated with a fake drug. What impact does that have on the economy? What impact does that have on a government expenditure on public health services? So, with that as an introduction, what we're going to do today is we have 5 speakers that are going to address this problem, from this topic from a slightly different angle. The first 2 speakers, Mr. David Cooper from Hewlett-Packard, David, and Mr. Kofi Asuman from Ghana, the National Anti-Counterfeiting Association down there, are going to set the stage by talking about the products that they see on the ground that are being counterfeited, pirated, trafficked. And then after they can sort of paint the real-life picture, what I'd like to do is introduce 2 academics to discuss some work that they've done to try to actually measure this problem. How do we take what we're seeing on the ground and how do we turn that into methodology and some math to generate some numbers to help us communicate the size of the problem to the politicians? And that will be Dr. Patrice Geoffron from Paris Dauphine University, also with Terra Consultants. And then in the place of Dr. O'Flaherty from Frontier, who I mentioned couldn't make it, the co-chair of BASCAP, because we co-published this report, David Benjamin, who's also Vice President of Universal Music, is going to sit in and try to communicate the key findings of that study to our group. Then finally, I have Dr. Karsten Fink from WIPO. He's the chief economist at WIPO, who's done a lot of research in the last, I think, 6 months to a year, looking into the types of research approaches, methodologies, what is the thinking behind, what are the costs and benefits to the society in terms of this problem. And he can share with us, I think, some, or start the discussion on what more needs to be done to quantify the problem. So with that as an introduction, I'd like to start with David Cooper. If you would, please come on up and share your slides with the group. Thanks. This is what I was talking about. I know. If this was a Hewlett-Packard, we wouldn't have a problem. And then I think we're going to
Jeff, thank you very much for your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As has been said, my name is Dave Cooper. I work for Hewlett-Packard, and I'm based in Geneva in Switzerland. I'm going to talk to you today about what I refer to as an opportunity to demonstrate to the CEO and senior management of Hewlett-Packard why they employ me, why they employ a team of people to protect our brand. I guess you're all here because you realise there's a problem globally with counterfeiting. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. The IT and printing supplies industry faces a multi-billion-dollar counterfeiting opportunity, an opportunity to reduce counterfeit market share from the market so that people buy a genuine product, because generally that's what they want to do, to buy a genuine product. Hewlett-Packard has a globally led brand protection model, counting in excess of 400 experts covering Europe, Middle East and Africa, Asia Pacific and Japan, and the Americas regions. We form partnerships with the World Customs Organization and other law enforcement agencies such as the police, Homeland Security Investigations, Customs and Border Protection, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, not to mention countless local police forces, countless national bodies who are involved in fighting counterfeiting. But you can't do this in a vacuum. You need to do it as part of a team, people working together. Working together means working like that. Doesn't mean working like that. So it's very important to have a team of senior business leaders, legal counsel, technical product and packaging experts, and corporate security professionals. Because with those ingredients, you can bake a cake that stands a chance of success. If you remove one ingredient from your cake, it's not going to be very palatable. I'm fortunate that the program that I lead at Hewlett-Packard has visibility right into the CEO's office. It's a little bit like being under that spotlight there, but perhaps 15 times more intense. I get to work with our product and packaging people. And I work on a daily, if not weekly basis with our business units to make sure they're getting value for money for the investment they make in our program. We spoke earlier about scoping. How do we scope this opportunity? We conduct investigations that are managed sometimes internally and often externally. We take intelligence and we look at intelligence, we review it, and we manage it appropriately. We use industry-leading, cutting-edge analytical technology. At Hewlett-Packard, we use Envisional. We also use New Momentum. We combine that with in-house analytical proprietary capabilities that we've developed, which enables us to take the intelligence that is out there, to absorb it, to use it, and to intelligently decide how we will enforce. We embrace channel and consumer communication, education and efficient feedback systems. If you say you have a problem, you should be in a position to quantify it. If you want people to make informed decisions, you should be in a position to educate them. So if you go to hp.com and you put counterfeit into the search part of that, that'll take you to a page that will enable you to have some information on identifying counterfeits of our products. Because if you don't educate, how can you expect people to be educated? If you don't help, how can you expect people to help you? The first thing that you should do as a brand, if you believe you have a counterfeiting problem, is identify that problem and be in a position to tell people about it. Because government aren't going to come and tell HP they've got a problem with counterfeits. More the other way around. And we invest in customer engagement. What do I mean by that? Quite simply, people buy HP products because they invest in a brand that they know has been quality controlled, has gone through a significant amount of research and development. And studies that we've conducted tell us that 90% of consumers who bought a counterfeit HP product thought they were buying the real thing. So people who work hard every month, like we all do, to earn a wage, to put a roof over our heads and food on the table, they were conned and tricked into parting with their money to buy something that was at best substandard and at worst possibly life-threatening. Gone are the days of some fabled Robin Hood approach to counterfeiting, stealing from the rich to pay for the poor. I'll leave you with one thought before I go to the next slide. If Al Capone was alive today, he'd be a counterfeiter. What gets counterfeited at HP? Pretty much everything we make, funnily enough. Inkjet print cartridges, laser print cartridges as well. Very big part of our company's revenue, and of course that's attractive to the counterfeiter. They have no overheads. We do their publicity, they just leech off of us. but also counterfeit hardware, memory hard drives, adapters, batteries, transceivers, switches. You name it, if we make it, they fake it, because there's money to be made. Jeff mentioned earlier about patient safety. I spent a number of years working in the pharmaceutical industry in anti-counterfeiting. And it's very, very true that the pharmaceutical companies have a very compelling message and story to tell about the potential dangers to patient safety. We at HP stopped counterfeit HP products getting into an air traffic control environment. We've identified and removed counterfeit HP hardware that was in banking institutes. We've identified and removed counterfeit hardware that has been in hospitals. And there have been cases of adapters and batteries catching fire, and you don't need me to tell you the dangers faced by a computer adapter in your children's bedroom catching a light and the damage that that could possibly cause. There isn't a counterfeit on this earth that doesn't pose a danger to people's safety, whether it's a CD, a DVD, a pair of sneakers, a razor, a pen, or whatever, because the people that gain their ill-gotten gains through counterfeiting aren't just counterfeiters. They're organised criminal organisations that exploit human beings in order to gain money. We as a company are a very good global citizen. We manufacture in an environmentally friendly manner. That's not the case for counterfeiters. When you go on a raid in Southeast Asia and you see people who are involved in refilling toner cartridges and they're wearing goggles because they look like they've just spent the last 45 days down a mine. They're wearing goggles to protect their eyes, but they're not protecting what they're inhaling, and these are women and children being exploited, because that's what counterfeiters do, they exploit. So often what happens with brands is a brand will get up and tell you about the best job they had 15 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever. This is locations that HP have enforced against in the last few months. And I'm not going to read all of the locations that are on there, but you can see that there are countries in the Asia Pacific and Japan region, in Europe, Middle East and Africa, and in the Americas. That's because counterfeiting is a global phenomenon. I'm often asked, how can you quantify what the problem is? Well, if you can take the tip of an iceberg and imagine that you're just looking at the tip of that iceberg, you might get somewhere to where you need to be. But how can you possibly model something that's clandestine? Because these people, they don't have production lines like we do that are checked and balanced. Merely what they do is they produce, some float into counterfeiting to one product and then float away. What is clear is that it's a huge problem. And as I said, it's a multi-billion-dollar problem to the IT industry. Counterfeiting is a growth market. In FY09, we seized 9.6 million counterfeits of HP products globally with the help of law enforcement. Roughly 1,200 investigations and slightly more than 900 enforcement actions. We took that into the following fiscal year and we increased the number of seizures by 2 million. But roughly we stayed with the same amount of investigations and the same amount of enforcement actions. That means that we're getting better at what we do. It means that we're identifying the targets that merit to be targeted. Still spending the same amount of time on investigation and enforcement actions. I mentioned earlier about Robin Hood. This isn't Robin Hood. This is an AK-47 Kalashnikov assault rifle that belonged to a counterfeiter in the Middle East that used this weapon to protect the goods that he was storing. We at HP don't employ people with Kalashnikovs to look after our product. and yet it's just as valuable. But these people, they do. And if that isn't sufficient, the last slide I'll leave you with shows another incident in the Middle East, where again you can see a Browning high-power semi-automatic firearm. Belonged to a counterfeiter who needed a firearm to protect the products that he was storing. Quite compelling images, I think. So in summary, what we have is we have opportunity for the counterfeiters to defraud, an opportunity for us as brands to claw back counterfeit market share, which is what we do. It's not an easy job, and I think we'll be around for a long time. But eventually, I believe that we will make progress through education to turn people away from purchasing from outlets where they shouldn't, in environments that they shouldn't, and people will realise that there isn't such a thing as a free lunch or a good deal. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks, David. Before we go to the next speaker, I'm going to go back a couple of slides here. This one, right here. This slide, I think, this embodies what we mean, what I meant earlier today when I was talking about brake pads. This is what Hewlett-Packard means when they're talking about brake pads. 1 year. Wow, I couldn't help thinking about this while I'm watching this. In 1 year, how much time, how many people is this company spending on investigations and raids and enforcement action and adjudications? Time, money, people that could be spent, making a cheaper printer cartridges.
Less expensive.
Less expensive, right. Exactly. No, but so what we'd asked David to do was set the stage for the discussion on how we go about measuring the problem. So I have one more speaker who's going to give us some real life tangible examples about what we mean by brake pads. And Kofi's got a few slides. If you can either do it from here or there. Figure out how to do that. I'm the moderator / IT guy.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm really delighted to join this forum for this discussion. We've heard of a lot of statistics on the scale of counterfeiting, and I wouldn't want to bore you with that, but it's really a big issue. But this morning, I was amazed to hear that about 700,000 people die from the use of fake malaria drugs. Then it occurred to me why it is happening in Africa. About 10% of medication sold globally is fake. But in developing countries like Africa, 30 to 40% of this medication is fake. No wonder we're having a lot of problems with malaria in Africa. What I'm beginning to realize is that this sets in motion a vicious cycle. People's incomes are low, so they would want to look for cheaper drugs. And then the cheaper drug does not give them any cure, and then it sets in death. Therefore, growth of the country is also hampered, and therefore, we always are behind. So it is really a big issue that needs attention. These are the industries that are affected by counterfeiting, and we've heard this over and over again: pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Just imagine somebody who wants to go on birth control and has anti-pregnancy pills which are counterfeited. You know very well that you are on these drugs. By the time you are aware, you have what you didn't plan to have. Cosmetics. In November, we organized a program in Ghana, and we targeted students. And there was this student who came up with scars on the face, and he told us that he uses a certain medication for the face, and the second time he went to buy it, he realized that the package was a bit different, but it was the same thing. So he bought it, and 2 days later, the entire face was swelling, and he had to be out of school for about a month. Food, textiles, watches, vehicle, and even spare parts for aircrafts, toys, music, video, software, as we've just heard, jewelry. All these have been counterfeited. Handbags, T-shirts, watches, iPods, cameras, kitchenware, all these are being counterfeited today. Drinks, alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages, food, and this is where it becomes really dangerous. One does not know what goes into these products. And a big one at that. Skincare and oral care products. All these are being counterfeited, and we have them on our markets. The drugs. Sometimes it is really difficult as a consumer to find out the difference between the real product, genuine one, and then the fake. And I am aware of situations where the fake products contains nothing more than cassava or maize starch, but people buy these. Now, the conditions under which these products are made can be appalling. And this is how they make them and sell to consumers. I would just want to cite an example of the impact of counterfeiting on the textile industry in Ghana. If you look at West Africa, the potential of the textile industry is about $2 billion US. And about 10 years ago, it was a rapidly growing and thriving business in West Africa, creating a lot of jobs for many, many, many people. I work for Unilever, and our factory is situated very close to a textile manufacturing company. And I remember about 15 years ago, in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, you see scores of vehicles conveying workers home. Today, that factory is closed, and the buildings have been turned into warehouses. Many, many workers have gone home. In Nigeria alone, there were about 200,000 people working in the textile industry in 1985. Today, it's dropped to just about 24,000. And there are a number of textile estates in Ghana and Nigeria and in other African countries. All these have collapsed because wherever you go today in West Africa, you find counterfeited textile prints everywhere. This is the magnitude of the problem we have. It's affecting employment, it's affecting health, and it's affecting government revenue. So I believe that this forum will provide us with the opportunity to work together and stem the menace of counterfeiting and piracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kofi. Okay, to the audience, I hope that you found the first two presentations to be of interest and to help paint the picture that we're trying to describe of what's actually happening on the ground in terms of products, sectors, industries, companies, what the impacts look like. So with that as a basis, fresh in our mind, what I'd like to do now is turn to two speakers who have undertaken to try to measure these impacts on a larger basis across industries, across sectors, and across borders. So the first speaker I'd like to introduce is Patrice Geoffron from Terra, and then it'll be followed by David representing Frontier. Now, before they speak, I want to note that ICC is very closely involved in this work. We asked them to undertake this work because we felt like this type of research is what needs to be done. And in no way do we claim that these are the end and final answer to anything, but we do stand by the work, and we are committed to finding and to investing in as much research as possible to help us better understand the problem. So with that, Patrice. Oh yeah, right. I forgot. I'm the IT guy. Oh, there it is.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey, to give me the possibility to present, I may say, our study in front of such an international and large audience. Unfortunately for the translator, I will speak in Englobish instead of proposing a presentation in a very classical French. You maybe know that French civil servants are supposed to speak French as much as possible, but today, since the presentation is in English, I will do my best to speak in English. Well, the starting point of that study was quite simple. There was a kind of too much philosophical debate as regard the economic impact of piracy in the field of audiovisual, of film industry, of music, and so and so. Most of the time, the debate was limited to a discussion as regard the way we were moving from one economic model to another one, and in the middle of that transition, we were supposed to be in a period rather of uncertainty, but behind that, we wanted to remind and to make the demonstration that there was revenue that were lost, that there was also jobs that were lost, and that problem that was a kind of hidden problem was obviously a big issue for Europe, especially because, as you know, in Europe we have a rather small national markets, and in front of that, that kind of fragmented national industries were most sensitive probably to piracy. And the problem also is that when we talk about piracy in that field, it is difficult to make the demonstration that there is a danger, because there is no health disease, as has been said before, there is no arms, and all of us can be a pirate, meaning involved in that problem in 2 clicks. And this is a reason why we are not completely comfortable with that issue. But nevertheless, we have tried our best to demonstrate that behind that we had, and we still have, and we probably have in the future, very important economic problems, and to make our best effort to make that demonstration. That study had been presented 1 year ago in March 2010 in the European Parliament, and I want to underline that its result has been endorsed by most of the trade union in that domain, meaning the Union Network International for Media and Entertainment Industries, meaning also the International Actor Federation. And it means that that view is not only the view of some academics and some BASCAP, but also it converges with what is observed on the ground by people that work in that industry. So what we have tried to do is, in fact, to focus on 3 main questions. Question 1, 1 and 1. Something happened. No. The first question was, first of all, to remind what is the scope of the so-called creative industries in Europe. And I will move directly to what the result we obtained. First of all, two words as regard the method. Most of time up to now in Europe, the result as regard the assessment of the economic size of creative industries was limited to the core copyright industries, with evaluation more or less equivalent to 3% of European GDP, which is impressive. But what we wanted to underline is that around that industry, we have many industry that directly or indirectly depends on that core creative industry, and that mechanically will be at risk due to piracy. And instead of amount more or less equivalent to 3% in the previous study, we have made a demonstration that in Europe today, creative industry and the interdependent industry represent close to 7% of European GDP, which is obviously an impressive amount, and most of time in a period of economic crisis. We also made a calculation as regard the jobs that were directly or indirectly related to that economic scope, and with an assessment equivalent to close to 15 million jobs. And you will find in that study that can be freely downloaded. You just make Terra Consultant and piracy, and you directly go to that study that is available in French, in English, and so. And you can find also details for the 5 main European markets, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. And you will observe that, for example, in the case of UK, that economic footprint is equivalent to 10% of UK GDP. Second question, we have tried to assess the consequences of piracy, both on retail revenues and job. And the idea behind was to say, well, we are obviously in the middle of wide diffusion of piracy tools and techniques. I don't know how to say that more precisely, and especially peer-to-peer. And we have taken data on a national basis as regard the rate of infringement combined with a substitution rate. You maybe know, if you are familiar with that kind of study, that a very sensitive dimension of the problem is how what is the proportion of sales that are not realized due to piracy. And for example, as regard music, which is a field in which we find the main the most important studies, we have evaluation for the most serious one from 10% to 30%, and we have selected as to be not to have an inflation of our result. We have retained the substitution rate equivalent to 10%. It means that each time that one people, maybe some of them are in the room today, download illegally one file of music or 10 files of music, it represents one file that is not sold and with a decrease of the revenue for the industries. And once again, you will find in the study a result on a national basis, but globally it represents for 2008 10 billion of euro in retail losses for all the sectors that were included in the study, meaning music, movie, TV series, and also software. It means that on the other side, we have not included, for example, issues that are probably important issue but that we were not able to include in the scope of the study from a technical point of view. I have in mind, for example, broadcasting of sport events. And maybe, and obviously for the future, the book industry will be probably the next on the list if nothing is done. So the starting point for 2008 is 10,000 retail losses and 10 billion euros in terms of retail losses and close to 200,000 jobs that were directly or indirectly lost. And the last question we tried to highlight was to make projection between the year that was our starting point, meaning 2008, to 2015. This is a kind of exercise as to send a clear warning. The basis of our analysis was to say we will take data from Cisco as regard the projection in terms of traffic between now and 2015, and that data were available, and we will modify that data inside of the model that was built for that study. And we have made two scenarios for the future. The first one is the so-called file sharing trend scenario, meaning that behind that we have the data of Cisco for file sharing, and meaning that behind that, and this is rather conservative, we have the assumption that the tools for piracy will continue to be centered on peer-to-peer. And in that case, we move up to 32 billion euro of losses for Europe once again, and up to 600,000 job losses in 2015. And we have done the same kind of exercise inside of another scenario, the so-called consumer IP traffic, meaning that behind that we have taken the projection of Cisco as regard the growth of IP traffic. And from my point of view, that kind of scenario is maybe more relevant due to the diversification of piracy tools in the future that won't be limited to peer-to-peer, but that will move especially in the field of direct download. I want to underline also that we have not been able to take into account other elements in that scope, meaning, for example, piracy related to mobile, for example, and that will be obviously a key question in the future with the growth of the bandwidth for mobile telecommunication. So what can we say to conclude? First of all, to remind what were the main results. First of all, for 2000, the scope of creative industries that are at risk due to piracy, to digital piracy mainly, represent a huge amount of, a huge proportion of GDP and of very qualified jobs in Europe. So the problem behind piracy in that domain cannot be anymore a philosophical problem. This is not only an issue of transition between two economic models. Things are to be done, and you will have some explanation this afternoon as regard what has been implemented in the scope of Adopi law in France. It will be the session of the beginning of this afternoon, I think. But it is impossible not to do anything. This is the first conclusion, and moreover, that conclusion is we have worked with the team in US that has done the same kind of calculation. I want to emphasize that this issue is obviously a big issue if we want to keep the diversity of our cultural heritage in Europe. So, just one last remark. We don't say anything as regard the solution to that problem in the study. The study was dedicated to assess the importance of the problem, which was quite an important contribution, I think, because nothing has been done before. But our aim was not to define what we were supposed to do. But my personal view is that we cannot have an objective to completely remove of the scope any digital piracy due to the large variability of that networks. This is not a consistent goal in terms of regulation and of public policy. But what we can obtain if, for example, Adobe law is a success, even a limited success, is a decrease of the intensity of piracy, giving the possibility for new economic model. I have in mind, for example, the case of Deezer, which is a French small business and a rather interesting startup. If we are not able to decrease the intensity of piracy, there won't be any economic space, any ability to breathe for that kind of startup. And then the aim of that regulation is to give more economic space for new economic model, not to preserve the economic model that we have behind us. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Patrice. Again, just drawing it back to some of the things that our leaders said, Francis Gurry in his opening remarks mentioned that we need a better understanding of the value of the intangibles. And what I liked about the approach that Tara took to that study is that it was a bit of a good news, bad news story. Because they start off by telling us what's the value of that intangible, what's the value of IP, what's the value of the products derived from IP to the creative industries in Europe. Let's start there. What's it worth? How many jobs, how many people get their living through this IP? And then the rest of the report is about what's at risk and what it costs us. So I thought it was a job well done, and I thank you for presenting that today. Now, what I've got here is a situation where we have 15 minutes and 2 more speakers. So if they each speak for 30 seconds, then that will leave a few minutes for discussion. Anyway, the next speaker is David Benjamin, who's going to present on behalf of Dr. O'Flaherty the study that we're launching today on the economic and social impact. So, David. Yes. Yeah, just straight down.
Okay. Damien worked on this for 18 months and put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this study, and then he got very sick and isn't here. He'll be better, and to the extent there's interest, I'm sure we could arrange a large conference call or something like that. But let me take you through the high points, because it's a very important piece of work that he's done. Since he's not here, I'm going to change the order of his slides. You'll remember that the OECD put out a report and tried to objectively quantify the harm done, the value of counterfeiting and piracy. Now, in their report, which was initially released in 2008, they only looked at the value of international trade. They identified 3 other areas where they were sure that if they did study, they would find and could quantify the value of counterfeiting and piracy. Those are domestic production, digital piracy, and then broader economic effects, which they identified. And so Damien started out with a study on the broader economy-wide effects and only looking at the G20. And you'll see that data as we move into this study. On those, he only looked at losses of tax revenues, welfare spending, the costs of crime, and impact on FDI flows. On digital piracy, we've only looked at software, music, and film, leaving aside books, which actually, in the time since Patrice did the terror study, is a major issue for the book publishers. We have not looked at video games, computer games, newspapers, magazines, or television at all in the context of this study. OECD initially estimated international trade, as you will recall, at $200 billion, and then a year later updated it to $250 billion, looking at more recent data, custom seizures. That data has been updated again to bring it forward in the context of this report. And quite honestly, we have to thank OECD, who shared with us their methodologies and formulas, so that this report could be as objective and authoritative as possible. Were used by Frontier in this report. Let me go to his first slide. Okay, so stuff we all know. I'll go quickly. One, underground, hard to get good data. What did he do? He built on established OECD approach and methodology, in fact, the precise formulas that the OECD came up with. Controversy over substitution rates. Patrice talked about this for a moment. There are no in this report, he only looks at value, not losses to business, because then you get into all sorts of arguments. The arguments aren't necessary. Let's start out by trying to determine what's the value of this enterprise. You know, Jeff said, BASCAP likes to invest in these things. We like to invest in them because the goal is, over time, to really focus on individual issues within reports so that the numbers that come out are more and more dependable, are subject to criticism, and therefore can be updated, reviewed, and done again. And that's what this report is all about. In studies that we have all read, there are a multitude of approaches and assumptions varying by country and by sector. Frontier moved to get rid of that and take a consistent approach to measurement. And certainly, as difficult as it is analyzing hard good piracy, analyzing digital piracy is much harder than that. And what Frontier has put in is a consistent framework to that approach. And this is the bottom line. And I think we have, do we have copies of the study? There are copies outside, and you should take one. And you should read it, because as I say, it's well over a year of work that's gone into this. In terms, and in each of these, what Damien did was create a range of values, once again, because it's impossible to pinpoint any precise values, but using very, very conservative assumptions. For instance, the actual growth rate in custom seizures, 22%. In order to come up with these figures and extend them, Damien cut that in half and said, no, it's not 22%. It's a mid-teen number, in order to just make them very, very conservative. The domestic number is derived from OECD formulas based on the international number. The digitally pirated number is really the first truly analytical look at the total scale of digital piracy in just those three industries, not the four that I mentioned, four others. The broader economic effects are only for the G20 nations. We haven't had the time or the wherewithal yet to extend those globally. And the employment losses are only for the G20 nations. Where this takes us, extended out to 2015, is a value for counterfeiting and piracy, which is well in excess of $1 trillion a year. It's an astounding number. It's one that deserves to be paid attention to be challenged, if challenges should be made, for the study to be done again by others, finding errors in the first study, do another study and another. But to the extent we can put out objective, authoritative information to governments so that they understand and can transmit to their citizens the real harm and risk of this marketplace, our hope is that more attention will be put to this area by government, and that we can begin to view the light at the end of the tunnel as something other than an oncoming train. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thanks, David. We have time for one more speaker, Dr. Karsten Fink from WIPO. I'm going to try to talk and IT at the same time to save seconds. So if you please come on up. Do I have? You know what? Lunch afterwards. It's not like there's another session coming in. I told him to take his time because none of you were in a hurry for lunch. So I figured that's okay.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and let me also thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to talk about quantifying the economic effects of counterfeiting and piracy. Now, realizing that I'm standing between you and lunch, this is not going to be easy, but I'll do my best. Just a few words of background. We have at WIPO a relatively new economics program. We've been around for a little more than a year. That seeks to provide generally evidence on the economic effects of different IP policy choices. We've done most of the work that we've done so far on questions of patents, I would say, and questions of innovation. And I think the question of whether IP enforcement is a obvious question, or the answer to that isn't entirely obvious. To begin with, I would argue that law infractions in general, including violations of IP laws, are inherently undesirable. I happen to believe that respect for the law is important for the modern day, for the functioning of modern day economies. And one of the things that I think is really worrisome if one looks at digital piracy, and this is a 10-minute presentation, so I can make sweeping statements. If you have a whole young generation growing up with disrespect for law in the sense of downloading copyright protected music, movies, and so on, I think that is inherently problematic. Now, the problem one faces is that we obviously know that eradicating piracy and counterfeiting is not that easy. And the resources that governments have to tackle that problem are invariably scarce. And governments face many public goods that are underprovided, and they also face many law enforcement challenges. And I very much agree with what was said this morning, that counterfeiting and piracy is not a north-south issue per se, but I think the one difference in particular you have between developing and developed countries is that developing countries are much more resource constrained than developed countries. And I think this is one of the reasons why counterfeit medicines are such a big problem in Africa and also in other developing countries. Countries face problems with drug trafficking, human trafficking, illegal logging, terrorism, and it is something that I guess sits uneasy with governments, but implicitly they do have to make choices about where to set priorities. And I think in that perspective, from that perspective, economic analysis has an important role to play, in a sense that we know that IP infringements and the economic effects and implications differ across different IP rights and industries. And there is need to compile evidence to inform policymakers on where they should set their priorities. Now, what would we ideally like to know? We want to know about the scale of counterfeiting and piracy activity. That is important, as I mentioned, when governments think about, how to tackle the many challenges that they face, they need to know how important is one problem in relation to another problem. But we're also interested in industry-specific effects. We want to know how companies are affected, how their sales are affected, how their profits are affected. Important also from a dynamic perspective, how their R&D investments are affected. We want to know, specifically in the area of copyright, how are creative workers affected? How is their income affected? How are products affected? The prices and quality of products. How do they look like in the presence of counterfeit or pirated goods? And we want to know how consumers are affected. What are their consumption choices in the presence of pirated and counterfeit goods? And also, that is important, what is the extent of confusion? We know that counterfeit drugs are much more problematic than, say, counterfeit handbags. And I apologize to producers of handbags, but we know, and there is, I think, credible evidence from surveys that consumers that buy counterfeit handbags usually know that they're buying a fake product, where that is usually not the case for consumers who buy fake medicines. Looking at the economy-wide effects, we are interested in employment and wage effects. We are interested in the fiscal impact, and we are interested in so-called negative externalities. Sorry for using economics jargon here. The negative externalities are the health and safety effects, security effects that others already talked about extensively. Now, if I can make another sweeping statement, I would argue that we have a number of studies, including the studies that were just presented, on the overall scale of counterfeiting and piracy activities. I think we need much more detailed studies about industry-specific effects and economy-wide effects, where we do have some studies, but I think if there is scope to do more analysis in the future, I think it is going beyond the big numbers and look at more at the more heterogeneous impact that illicit activities have. Now, how do we go about economic analysis? I think one of the things that is important, and that I think some of the studies frankly get wrong, or are a bit uncertain about, is to carefully set out the counterfactual scenario. In a sense, if you ask the question, well, what is the impact of counterfeiting and piracy? We're asking the question, well, how would economies look like? How would companies behave if there wasn't any piracy? And I think there it's important to make a distinction between looking at the impact of certain given levels of illicit activities, which I would believe is probably characterizing the long-run effect of these illicit activities, and what is the effect of changes in levels of illicit activities, which I think is important, especially when it comes to digital piracy, where the year-to-year changes are quite dramatic. Then what you need is a model. We just talked about the work that the OECD has done. Again, apologies for using jargon here. In economics, there is an important distinction between so-called partial equilibrium model and general equilibrium model. In simplified terms, you would use a partial equilibrium to look at industry-specific effects. And, that is important, that is interesting. But, the point about partial equilibrium models is that, they abstract from the interaction that specific industries have with a broader economy, whereas, that is precisely what general equilibrium models are doing. And, you want to know both. You want to know how is the music industry affected by higher levels of piracy, but you also want to know how is the economy as a whole affected. And I think on the latter one, again, I think there it's important to set out carefully the counterfactual scenario. If you think of something like employment, and there were employment numbers presented earlier on, I think, in the short term, you would think that particular industries are clearly negatively affected in terms of, workers losing their jobs. But in the longer term, we have to think about the labor market as a whole. If you look at projections by most central banks, they, in the long term, and that is very much part of their job, predict that economies converge to full-time employment. That is maybe hard to believe these days, when we have just when we're just recovering from a major financial crisis. But one has to realize that if workers lose their jobs, that they look for other ones, and many workers do find other jobs. That's why, in the longer run, the question of job losses is probably less interesting than the questions of earning differentials. How does the earning differential of different workers differ if you take into account certain levels of counterfeiting and piracy? Now, once you have the model, the obvious thing to do is to try to gather data on as many variables that you can: prices, quantities of genuine and fake goods, other relevant variables. And you also need certain estimates of behavioral parameters. In particular, how do consumers behave when confronted with different consumption choices? Now, again, making sweeping statements here, I think the first two elements of economic analysis are relatively easy. Also, the choice of economic models, there is a large literature, there is a large academic literature that gives a wide choice of models that researchers can draw on. I think the real deficit is on questions of data, and any final estimate that comes out is only as good as the numbers, the quality of the numbers that go in. Now, the obvious challenge when it comes to measurement is that counterfeiting and piracy mostly escape official statistical recording. I say mostly here because you do have some official statistics, in relation to enforcement activities at borders. So you have some customs statistics. You have some information on domestic law enforcement activities. There are also data reported by rights holders. There are certain self-standing surveys done by different organizations that I think compile interesting information, especially on consumer behavior. But I would argue that we probably can do better. This is not something that happens from today to tomorrow. This is a longer-term process. Governments need to invest in better data collection. I think one aspect that maybe has made it a little bit easier. Information technology, on the one hand, has facilitated opportunities for especially piracy, to some extent counterfeiting, but with new information and communication technologies, you also have new opportunities to collect data. And I think over time, data have already improvement. Certainly, I think there is scope for improving the depth and the international comparability of official statistics, which is an issue when it comes to trade statistics, customs statistics, as the OECD report pointed out. I would also argue that there is scope to increase the transparency of rights holders' data. That was one of the conclusions that came out of a report that WIPO recently commissioned on broadcasting rights, on the specific questions of broadcasting. Again, this is a rather sweeping conclusion. I think there are nuances to this, and I think in a number of industries you have had industry making more data available. And also what I think is important is to be clear about the methodologies that industry uses to arrive at different estimates. But as I mentioned, this is a long-term process, and I think improvements are possible. I think it still leaves a challenge for government in a sense that I would argue that even if in the next few years we see greater efforts to compile better statistics, the numbers that policymakers will look at will still be estimates. They will hopefully be better. They will hopefully be more reliable, but policymakers need to make decisions, and they need to, as I mentioned earlier, allocate their scarce enforcement resources in certain ways. But to the extent that we can be helpful as economic analysis, I think we should do the best that we can. Let me stop here and Thank you all.
Okay, thanks, Karsten. You know, as it turns out, the way we were going to end this session was to have a discussion really on where we needed to go next, because we started with the real-life facts, and then we talked about some of the early research conducted by Terra and Frontier, and then put on the top of where do we need to go. I would say that the last two slides you put up there gave us a pretty good roadmap of the types of things we need to do. I mean, we know we need better data. There's a lot of holes in the data. We need better methodologies, you know. So that's where we're going. We're hoping that at least the two pieces of work we've done, as David said, will inspire others, you know, to redo the study if you need to, or to do another one, or to bring more data to the table. But that's what this aspect of the fight against counterfeiting is all about. You know, the other workshops that are outside this room are looking at a lot of the policy changes that we're trying to implement on top of this. But perhaps if we can do a better job telling the story of why brake shoes are so important, then I think we'll make a lot of progress this week. So, should I open? Does anyone have a burning question? If not, you know, you're welcome to come by the table that we have set out for the ICC, where we have copies of all of these reports and plenty of materials. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about anything that was presented today. So with that, I thank you, and good day.
Yeah, hello.